Is discrimination really that bad? Is it really just a learned behavior? Also, should discrimination be illegal? And more importantly, does anyone really believe that discrimination is bad and practices what he preaches? These are the questions we will explore today. Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. Now, I've been promising for quite some time now that I'll be making a more comprehensive video about discrimination in order essentially to unify and further clarify the points being made in this video and also this video, and as well as other videos on this channel. Actually, it kinda has been a recurring theme on this channel that discrimination gets a bizarre image in the current mainstream. Anyway, so buckle up because we have quite a lot to cover. Let's start with the last question asked in the intro. Does anyone really believe that discrimination is bad and practices what he preaches? And then we'll go backwards in the order of the questions being asked. We'll do a backtracking to crack this problem. Anyway, the short answer is no. Nobody, nowhere, anywhere believes that discrimination is bad per se and simultaneously practices what he preaches. The easiest way to test this is to ask random people on the street what internet service provider they use, and then ask them why are they so mean as to discriminate against the poor little oppressed employees of a competing ISP. For instance, when I choose to buy chicken meat from this producer, I essentially discriminate against other producers, and if enough people practice an identical prejudice with mine, real people will be hurt because of my prejudice against chicken meat from other producers. When you choose to go on YouTube and watch one of my videos, a black woman somewhere is losing out because you choose to watch me. When I chose YouTube as a host for my channel, employees at Vimeo got hurt. Every day I discriminate against the employees at Marlboro because I choose to buy Rothmans. Non-smokers, on the other hand, they also discriminate against employees at, let's say, British American Tobacco because they spend their money on oranges or whatever. Essentially, everyone discriminates multiple times a day against someone else. Conversely, everyone is being discriminated against multiple times a day in favor of someone else. You may not think of it as discrimination, but it is. Every single choice you make is discriminatory against someone else. For instance, when you open a family business, the fact that you prefer your daughter as an employee over some random individual from a jobs fair is not only discrimination, but it's nepotism, which is another perfectly normal behavior that gets a bad reputation from the prevailing doctrine of envy, commonly known as socialism, which ironically, it's the doctrine that tends to promote the most nepotism. But anyway, I'm digressing. What I'm trying to say is that no, you don't actually practice non-discrimination. But don't worry, nobody else does either. Even the anti-discrimination activists are highly discriminatory in their behavior. Now, the second question in our reversed order is a bit more complex and it will take a little bit more time. So, should discrimination be illegal? Again, the short answer is no, not really. The thing is that the prevailing wisdom is that equality under the law is fundamentally good. Now, whether you believe that yourself or not is irrelevant at this point. But think about it this way. Is there such thing as equality under the law? Now, all countries, for instance, treat citizens and non-citizens differently in some way, shape, or form. Well, that's institutionalized discrimination for you based on the place you were born. Also, universal suffrage is not so universal. In addition to some prison inmates and some convicted felons, all countries discriminate against people who have, let's say, paranoid schizophrenia. Those people are barred from voting through no fault of their own and have no way of overcoming that. That's institutionalized ableism for you. Isn't this fun? Now, many people, including myself, tend to say that the state should indeed pander to the lowest common denominator and practice as little discrimination as possible, for the simple reason that the state is supported by all the people, and the people cannot just choose another state, since the state is in and of itself a monopoly. But when you think things through a little bit, one has to conclude that's not possible either. Non-citizens also do support the state whenever they buy anything with VAT attached, which is to say virtually everything in Europe. Yet that doesn't stop the states to discriminate against non-citizens. Also, many citizens don't contribute at all to the state, yet the state should somehow pretend that those citizens are somehow equal to those who do. When you put things into these kinds of words, suddenly the issue of state discrimination doesn't sound that simple anymore, doesn't it? Now, moving further, the prevailing wisdom amongst the let's take the nuances into account crowd is that at the very least, discrimination should be forbidden on grounds that the individual himself or herself cannot change. Well, that is to say, discrimination on religious grounds may sometimes be okay, since one can change his religion, unless it's Islam, in which case it's more complicated, but discrimination on, let's say, racial grounds can never be okay, since one cannot change his race. Well, unless you're Rachel Dolezal, or Sean King, or a Tumblr user, or a skilled troll, since race is self-identified these days. What stops me from saying I'm an Asian Korean? Anyway, joke aside, if discrimination based on grounds that the individual cannot change can never be okay, then why don't we abolish, let's say, sex segregation in prisons? What could possibly go wrong? And why maintain this wretched, antiquated, and sexist policy? Shouldn't institutionalized discrimination on unchangeable grounds be verboten? Also, the criteria for 100-meter runnings are inherently advantageous to black Kenyan men and inherently disadvantageous to any other type of human. All other humans are discriminated against in this field on grounds that they simply cannot change. Now, as you may have guessed, what I'm trying to say here is that once we get down to earth and away from the ideological grounds on which the anti-discrimination crusade is based upon, we suddenly realize that trying to abolish discrimination is a retarded idea per se. Now, why is that, you may ask? Well, because people, are not equal. They never have been equal, never will be equal, and they never should be equal. Diversity is good. See what I did there? Now, once this kind of argument is being presented, the anti-discrimination crowd tends to lose its temper and throw random stuff at you, such as Nazi Germany, the Jim Crow laws, the Japanese imperialism, and so on and so forth. The problem is that these have no connection to the topic whatsoever, since they represent examples of state-enforced discrimination, just like sex segregation in prisons, or the barring of paranoid schizophrenics from voting. Now, if this comparison offends you, then welcome to my world, which is the world in which things are a little bit more complex than discrimination is bad, okay? Now, one of the reasons this discussion is worth having is because whilst most people will agree in some way, shape, or form that state-enforced discrimination is generally a bad idea, most people, however, if pressed hard enough, will fundamentally disagree with state-enforced integration as well. Now, if you don't like the term state-enforced integration, then anti-discrimination laws will do just fine, since they're essentially synonymous. Now, the Jim Crow laws, as I said in other videos, were wrong because they prohibited different kinds of people from associating with each other freely. The catch is that the so-called anti-discrimination laws do exactly the same as well. You see, freedom of association is essentially twofold. It's both the freedom to associate with whomever you please, and the freedom not to associate with those whom you don't like. The second part tends to be routinely forgotten, and that's a huge issue per se. For instance, distinguished professor of economics Walter E. Williams has been explaining for decades now that the right to discriminate is fundamental, and that the true test to one's commitment to freedom of association is when one will be willing to defend a private association that associates in ways that one finds absolutely appalling. This is analogous with the much more well-known stance that one who is truly committed to freedom of speech will defend someone else's right to say the most appalling and offensive things. Walter E. Williams says, and I quote, "Should people have the right to discriminate by race, sex, religion, and other attributes? In a free society, I say yes. Let's look at it. The Nation of Islam discriminates against white members. The Aryan Brotherhood discriminates against having black members. The Ku Klux Klan discriminates against having Catholic and Jewish members. The NFL discriminates against hiring female quarterbacks." You say, Williams, that's different. It's not like public transportation, restaurants, and hotel service, in which Title II of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, quote, prohibits discrimination because of race, color, religion, or national origin in certain places of public accommodation, such as hotels, restaurants, and places of entertainment. While there are many places that do indeed serve the public, it doesn't change the fact that they are privately owned, and who is admitted under what condition should be up to the owner. One does not have to be a racist to recognize that the government has no authority to prohibit racial or any other kind of discrimination by private parties. Now that sounds like a Nazi, like a white supremacist, right? Oh wait. Anyway, I'll leave a link in the low bar for you to read Professor Williams' argument in full. It's very interesting and very educational. The thing is that perfectly fine arrangements can be deemed illegal in some jurisdictions, particularly in Europe, just because a tiny fraction of the populace, which is not connected to the arrangement in any way, shape, or form, happens to disapprove. For instance, how many people in Britain are bothered by the fact that some people decided to make their barber shop male only? I would wager to say that most people in Britain don't even care enough to have an opinion. You know, they got jobs to work and bills to pay. They don't have the time to think about some random barber shop. Yet under the absolutist anti-discrimination laws, or as I like to call them, state-enforced integration policies, that arrangement is under constant legal assault because women cannot choose to become men. Well, unless they do, in which case it's mandatory to call them Mr. or MX. And if you don't, you're something phobe, depending on how the wind blows today. More to the point, these kinds of laws eventually end up hurting people acting generally in good faith, because the actual racists and sexists and whatever ists can and indeed will find workarounds all the time. As an example, think of the Turkish-specific bars and restaurants in Germany. Sure, it is illegal to put up a sign reading "No whites allowed" or "No Germans allowed," but it is not illegal to make an establishment that is with Turkish-specific, which happens to include a requirement that you only speak Turkish inside, which in turn happens to be, in practicality, the same thing as saying "No whites allowed." Or for the barber shop example, one can announce that no individual haircuts are offered and that all services must come with a shaving service included, which in effect excludes women from there. What I'm trying to say here is that state-enforced integration policies promote a less honest society, as people have to think harder to come up with workarounds. If no such policies would exist, the real bigots would be open about their beliefs, and the market will sanction them either through low profits or even bankruptcy if the offense is serious enough in the eyes of the community at large. Now, how do I know this? Well, in most of Eastern Europe, it is legal to discriminate against anyone in most private establishments as long as you announce it up front. Specifically for restaurants and bars, you get an exemption from the anti-discrimination laws if you put up a sign that says, "We reserve our right to select our clientele." If you do that, you are under no legal obligation to receive anyone for any reason. And if or when you exclude a client, you are under no legal obligation to tell anyone why you did it, including the excluded client. Yet despite this, cases of clients being excluded on immutable characteristics such as race or sex are so rare that when they happen, they end up being news, as opposed to, let's say, car accidents, which happen so often that only the most spectacular of them end up being news, whilst most of them are never mentioned. So, should discrimination be illegal? Well, no, not really. Private establishment should have the right to discriminate because freedom of association is indeed absolute and because the effects are far less severe than the effects of state-enforced integration and are also far less severe than what the opponents of freedom would have you believe. Paraphrasing Professor Williams, when prejudice and bigotry are confronted by the specter of higher profits, by breaking that prejudice or by keeping the bigotry for oneself, it is very likely that profits will win. Going further, is discrimination really just a learned behavior? Well, the short answer is no, it isn't. Multiple studies have shown that people, regardless of their race, culture, creed, color, whatever, they tend to hang out with people who look like them. They tend to breed with people who not only look like them, but are very similar at a genetic level. Oh, and identical twins tend to choose mates that resemble them and each other, which in essence means that if I'd had a twin brother, my brother's girlfriend would resemble my girlfriend quite a lot. And this has been noticed even with twin brothers who were separated at birth and did not know about the existence of the other twin brother. Now, I'll leave links for further reading on that in the low bar. These patterns are not conscious or learned. These patterns are ingrained into us as humans. In other words, people are born with a strong tendency towards associating with each other in ways that are in direct contradiction of the received wisdom on anti-discrimination. What's truly funny is that those manifesting that tendency the most are exactly the most vocal ones on anti-discrimination issues. For instance, the pushers of progressive racism in Sweden tend to live in closed communities where there is no diversity. The same is true in other parts of the world as well. You won't see a white progressive living in a diverse area defending state-enforced integration. That just doesn't happen. What I'm saying here may sound insensitive or whatnot, but the evidence is overwhelming. In 2013, Dustin Cable at University of Virginia's Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service created a map of the United States using census data and discovered, surprise, surprise, that when it comes to general trends, all people segregate themselves voluntarily. In other words, when coercion is removed and freedom of association runs rampant, people generally associate themselves in ways that are fundamentally antithetical to the anti-discrimination narrative. But here's the catch. This arrangement also allows the exceptions to express themselves. Under state-enforced segregation, the exceptions were banned from existing. Under state-enforced integration, most people are being trampled on. And that's why one should prefer freedom over anything else. So, we reached the final question. Is discrimination really that bad? Whilst no one can deny that certain instances of discrimination can indeed yield terrible results at an individual level, discrimination in general is not only good, but precious. The late Christopher Hitchens used to say, quote, "It especially annoys me when racists are being accused of discrimination. The ability to discriminate is a precious facility. By judging all members of one race to be the same, the racist precisely shows himself as incapable of discrimination." Now, if this quote sounds confusing, think of what discrimination is. What does it mean? Well, the etymology of the word is very helpful in here. The word discrimination comes from the Latin word discriminatio, which in accusative is discriminationem, which means the making of distinctions. The word discriminatio itself is derived from the other Latin word called discernere, which means to divide or to separate or to discern. In other words, the ability to discern right from wrong and the ability to discern individuals without regards for the collectives they belong to is in and of itself an act of discrimination. For instance, I like Thomas Sowell and Walter E. Williams, but from this you ought to understand that I like these men in some way. If you try to squeeze from that assertion that I like black men in general, then you would be wrong, because I discriminate between individuals. I make distinctions and separate the people that I like from, well, the people that I don't like. This dude here may be part of the same collective with the two esteemed professor, but that doesn't mean I like him as well, because I discriminate. That's what Hitchens was referring to, and that's why I say that discrimination is generally good and precious. The ability to distinguish between individuals is precious in and of itself, especially for freedom-oriented people. Here's another example. These two individuals are part of the same collective. But the ability to discriminate helps us see that one is a successful prime minister who, although imperfectly, fundamentally advanced the cause of freedom. The other one is, well, just that. Now, I give this example because it also shows that the so-called anti-discrimination crowd also shows remarkable ability to discriminate, just like the rest of us. Just mention Margaret Thatcher in leftist circles as a role model for women in politics, especially amongst feminists. And also make sure you casually mention Lady T's position on feminists, and then watch as the anti-discrimination, diversity and inclusivity lovers go full force with their ability to discriminate between good people and oppressors. Does this make the anti-discrimination crowd a bunch of hypocrites? Well, yes, but more importantly, it makes them human, just like the rest of us. No matter how much progressivist agitprop and unfounded elitism you swallow, at the end of the day, you are not special. You do discriminate just like the rest of us. It's just that you're not honest about it. Anyway, so if one's goal is the betterment of individuals or groups that are supposedly treated badly, then the first step towards achieving that goal is to acknowledge reality. And this includes not only that discrimination exists and it's inherent and precious per se, but it also includes the acknowledgement of two other unpleasant truths, namely that human nature is in and of itself imperfect and that people are fundamentally unequal. Now, once utopian nonsense is gone and reality is being acknowledged, then we can talk about policies of any kind. But for as long as any discussion starts from utopian premises, such as that not only it is desirable but achievable to actually eliminate people's ability to make distinctions, i.e. to discriminate, and for as long as any discussion starts from fairy tales, such as that people are equal and that human nature is perfect, the Rousseau theme, and for as long as this happens, any discussion on policy is essentially useless, a waste of time. Screaming that everyone is the same, I'm sorry, but it doesn't make it so. Also, the other argument, namely that while not everyone is equal or the same, everyone can and indeed is equal in value, has the same inherent retardation in it. No, sorry, not all people are equal in value, not even by a long shot. For instance, if I hadn't been born, humanity would not have been worse off. But if Einstein hadn't been born, humanity would have definitely been worse off. No matter how flattering the proposal may sound, namely that I am of equal value with Einstein, it would be insane for me or anyone else to claim that I am of equal value with Nikola Tesla or with Einstein. Some people simply are more valuable than others. Sometimes that's easy to determine, and sometimes it's not that easy. But even when it's not easy to determine, one can still discern the differences between them. As an analogy, look at these numbers. It's a bit hard to notice at a first glance which of these two numbers is bigger, but we can easily notice that they are different. In other words, we notice without paying too much attention that the two are unequal and thus there is a distinction between them. It may be a minor distinction, but there is one. Noticing that is an act of discrimination in and of itself. Alright, I think I made myself clear enough, though I suspect that no matter how much I explain, it won't be enough for those who want to hear supremacy and some other nonsense, when in reality, this video is a testament of humility, the humility of human reason in the face of the laws of the universe. So, what do you think? Have I missed something? No, I tried to combine the philosophical reasoning with as many examples as possible because that's a way to make a point clear enough. For instance, if I were to just list some principles and not providing real-world reference, points may be entertaining for uber geeks, but it's hard to follow for most people. So anyway, tell me in the comments where do you think I'm wrong or what do you think I should have added to this presentation, and let's get the conversation going. And with that being said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.